Hi everyone, I'm Rincey and this is Rincey Reads. I'm back doing my weekly wrap up. I feel like this week has been so much longer than it usually feels. I mean, it's 2020, time has no meaning, but it definitely feels like there was an extra day thrown in this week. But anyways, I have 3 things to talk about this week. Maybe that's also why this week felt so long. I feel like I read a lot, although one of them is a comic. So yeah, let's jump into it. So first up, I have Winter Counts by David Heska, Wanbli, Weiden. This is a relatively new mystery thriller released. This is by an Indigenous author. In this story, you are following this character named Virgil, Wounded Horse, who is basically the local enforcer on the Rosebud Indian Reservation in South Dakota. If you aren't aware, because I wasn't aware until I started reading like more stories that are based on reservation, there is sort of like tribal enforcement, like law enforcement, which is relatively limited in scope in terms of like what it can and cannot prosecute, and then everything outside of that falls under federal jurisdiction because a lot of like really big crimes fall under federal jurisdiction. A lot of crimes basically go unpunished or even like uninvestigated, basically because the federal investigators don't want to like really bother with some of this stuff unless it has like something major tied to it and something huge for them. They're like not really incentivized to investigate these crimes. So Virgil, Wounded Horse, is someone who lives on the reservation who people basically contact when they need him to do some enforcing. So the story begins with him like beating up this guy who has basically been like molesting children and things along those lines. But the main crux of the story follows Virgil as he is hired kind of secretly by his like ex-girlfriend's father, who is on the tribal council, to investigate basically heroin that is coming in to the reservation. The guy who hires him basically has a pretty strong idea about who is bringing in the heroin, and he hires Virgil to basically take care of it and stop this from happening. I really enjoyed this book, honestly. It was a really fast, compelling read. I feel like a lot of the mystery books that I've been reading lately have been slightly more on the like suspense atmosphere side of things, and this one was really fun, really fast paced. I feel like I was like immediately pulled into the story. The author does a really, really great job with like making you feel like you are part of the day-to-day life on this reservation. There are like chapters in here where you are following Virgil, Wounded Horse, while he's doing sort of like normal things on this reservation. So like while he is having a meal or like talking about different things, talking to different people. So like you definitely learn about what like this community's life is like and what their situation is like and things like that. And what really surprised me is that like none of those details felt like a burden to the rest of the story, in my opinion. Like I feel like it was all part of like the world that the author was creating and like this picture that he was painting for you, and it honestly like didn't really like weigh down the mystery, which in a lot of mysteries sometimes it can do that. So yeah, I feel like if you're someone who reads mystery books on a regular basis, this is definitely one to put on your list. I wouldn't say it necessarily like does like mind-blowing things with the genre, but it's always really great to get mysteries from a perspective that's not the typical Western white perspective. Obviously this takes place in South Dakota, so it's still in America, but obviously the native perspective is always appreciated. But I will say, like, I didn't necessarily guess what exactly was going down. Like the crime turns out to be like obviously more complicated than just finding this guy and stopping him from bringing in heroin. So that's always like kind of like a nice surprise as well. One of the aspects of this book as well is that like Virgil, Wounded Horse's nephew actually ends up overdosing on heroin, and like that whole storyline and sort of the involvement of Virgil in his nephew's life and kind of talking about what it's like for Native teenagers growing up on reservations, or like how they end up becoming like ostracized in their own communities in different ways and stuff like that. All of it was really well done, really fascinating. I definitely recommend this book. So again, Winter Counts, if you are a mystery reader, should definitely be on your list. And then next I picked up The Compton Cowboys by Walter Thompson-Hernandez. This is a nonfiction book, and I actually started reading this one on ebook. I got the ebook from the library, and then I realized like the way that it was written, I would probably enjoy it more on audio, and Scribd happened to have a copy of the audiobook available on their service, so I listened to it that way, and I honestly highly recommend listening to it. So the basic idea or focus of this book is this group called the Compton Cowboys, who are a group of Black men and women who ride horses and are cowboys, obviously. But like the idea is just that, like, if you think of Compton, if you know anything about sort of like the cities here in the United States, if you think about Compton, you think of like very urban, very poor now areas. And so like the idea of like someone being from the Compton area but also being a cowboy feels sort of counterintuitive. But I feel like over the course of 2020, in like protests in various cities, you've been seeing more and more Black people who are riding horseback while protesting. So I feel like this book really falls nicely into that sort of increased exposure that Black cowboys have been getting, at least in recent media, in my opinion. So this book is written by a New York Times reporter, and it really feels like a long form profile kind of expanded out a little bit. It doesn't feel padded by any means, but you're following like a bunch of different people who are all part of this like sort of Compton cowboy ranch and their sort of history and how they got into all of this. And so it follows this one specific ranch that was founded by this Black woman named Maisha in the 1980s. And so the story is kind of taking place in modern day, and Aisha is basically retiring and figuring out what exactly she's going to do with the ranch. There's potential that like someone else is going to take over, and she's figuring out what to do with all of the horses and whether or not anyone can buy any of these horses and stuff like that. So it kind of takes both this view of like the history of this place and sort of what it's meant for different people in the area, and how it's evolved over time and it's sort of like ups and downs over the course of its history, as well as like profiling some of the people who are involved. There are the people here who are like trying to be in charge or trying to take over ownership and things like that, and sort of like them trying to figure out how to like be a good leader. You have people who may have been a part of gangs, who may have been in jail, things like that, and this is sort of like their second chance. You have this one woman who's highlighted who's like a single mom who wants to be like a rodeo rider, and there's actually a couple of people in here who want to like compete in rodeos, and kind of like that tension of being a Black person who wants to compete in rodeos, and also sort of like how they're viewed outside of like this Compton circle. I think the biggest sort of downfall for this book is that honestly for me there's not quite enough like history or context given. There is some, but I feel like there's a lot more to sort of like the Black cowboy history that isn't really explored in here, and that was probably like a purposeful choice. The author is specifically focusing on like this specific farm, this specific group of people, and this very like relatively narrow timeline and things like that. But that again just makes it feel more like a long form profile that you would find in like New York Times Magazine. That doesn't mean it's bad. I definitely still feel like it was worth picking up, and I found it really, really fascinating. And I think that also the author does a really great job of like not polishing off the edges of these people. A lot of these people are still affiliated with gangs in different ways. A lot of these people, you know, don't make good life choices, and the author doesn't try to hide that. He like provides these people as who they are without any sort of like judgment or anything like that. He's just presenting like these are just the people who are part of this group, flaws and all, which I always think is really great. So yeah, I definitely think that this was worth reading, and again, I definitely recommend it on audiobook. If you are someone who like really enjoys nonfiction on audio, I feel like this one was really, again, engaging and interesting and stuff like that. Although I have heard that like the physical copy has photographs in it, so there's also that. But yeah, I enjoyed it for the most part. I just kind of ended the book being like, I want more of it. All right, and then finally I read The Love Bunglers by Jaime Hernandez. This is a comic that I picked up because, as I've mentioned in like many previous videos, one of my New Year's resolutions was to work through the AV Club Best Comics of the Decade list that came out at the beginning of 2020 or end of 2019, and this was one of the comics on there. I'm not planning on like finishing that list this year, but I am going to try to like get through a couple more of them before the end of the year. In this story, you are mainly following this character named Maggie, and what I realized after looking this up on Goodreads after I had finished this is that this is part of like a longer running series of comics that had been like coming out since like the 1980s. So like this character of Maggie is like known and loved for being part of this other comic series called Love and Rockets, I believe. And so the point of this book is you're basically following her as she's in her like 20s, 30s. I want to say there's no exact age given, and you do get a couple of flashback scenes from when she's younger as well. So it's kind of like a slice of life comic, but you're kind of getting like these flashes or moments of story for this one character. And there is like a through line through all of it. But I will say that one, it definitely feels when you're reading this book like you're missing something. And again, it's part of a longer running series, so that completely makes sense. But I will say that, like, even though it's obvious that it's part of something larger, like, this book is still pretty beautiful. I was like very impressed by it overall. There are some like really graphic things that happen in here, specifically like child assault, like sexual assault, and it's a comic, so that was like a little bit jarring to see. So warnings for that. Overall, I found this to be like a really interesting and moving story. It talks about basically like family and love and relationships and things like that. But I will say, like, by the end of it, I like almost cried at some of the events that occurred. There's some interesting things that happen in here with like single panels and explorations of relationships and stuff like that that I found really beautiful. The entire thing is in like black and white, and like it's very interesting to see sort of like how all of the characters basically, I'm trying to make sure that all of the pages that I'm showing don't have naked people on it, because that definitely is a thing in this story. But yeah, overall I enjoyed it. Definitely for mature audiences only, and definitely a trigger warning for this book. But overall, I'm really glad that I read it, and I definitely feel like I should look up some of the other books in the series, because it was like definitely very interesting and very beautiful. So yeah, I definitely enjoyed this one. All right, so that is everything I've read so far. I am currently reading Thorn by Intisar Kanani. I wanted to make sure I said that correctly. This is a relatively new young adult fantasy book. I haven't seen anyone talking about this book, but I was like browsing my library's website, as you do when you're bored, and the cover just caught my eye. So I was like, hey, that looks interesting. So I like put it on hold, and it eventually came in. This week I have been like DNFing books left and right, and I realized that this hold had come in, and I haven't read a fantasy book in a while, and I was like, maybe fantasy will be the thing that clicks with me, and it does. I'm not like super far into it, so I can't really comment on it beyond the fact that like the writing style is vibing with my brain right now, and really that's all I'm looking for. So I'll probably be back next week to talk about it in more detail, but this is, I think, a retelling of some sort of fairy tale. But again, I'm very much at the beginning stages of this, so I can't really give you guys like any more information. You can look it up yourself if you're interested. So yeah, that's everything I have for this week. Let me know down in the comments below how your week has been going reading wise, and if you've picked up anything particularly interesting. So yeah, that's all I have for now. Thanks for watching.